Chosen one, before you listen to another word, I want you to quietly scan the last 2 hours of your day. Not quickly, not casually, but carefully. Think about where you were, what you were doing, what you were feeling. Did those minutes pass clearly in your memory? Or do they feel strangely blurred together like pages in a book that were flipped too fast to read? Perhaps you remember opening your phone intending to do something simple and meaningful. Maybe you planned to read a verse, send a message, check something important, or simply take a moment to breathe. Yet somehow those minutes slipped away. Your eyes moved across screens, your hands stayed busy, your mind jumped from one thought to another. But when you try to recall exactly what happened, there is a strange emptiness there. It is as if you were awake yet not fully present. You were moving yet not truly arriving anywhere. And somewhere in the middle of that fog, you may have felt something else rising quietly inside you. A restlessness in your chest. A tension you could not explain. A feeling like you were waiting for something though you could not name what it was. Many people would dismiss that sensation as stress or fatigue. Some would blame it on a long day, too much work, or too much noise from the world. But listen carefully, because what you experienced may not have been ordinary distraction at all. What you experienced may have been a moment of spiritual interruption. There are rare moments when heaven initiates contact with the human heart. These moments do not always arrive with thunder, lightning, or dramatic signs. Often they begin quietly, almost invisibly, like a signal attempting to connect with a receiver. Exactly 2 hours ago, something may have happened within the unseen realm around you. A transmission was initiated. A message began moving toward your spirit, carrying insight, direction, and clarity meant specifically for your life. But the moment that channel opened, something else moved quickly to interfere with it. Instead of silence, there was noise. Instead of clarity, there was confusion. Instead of peace, there was pressure and tension. You might have felt your focus slipping away, your thoughts scattering like leaves in a strong wind. You may have found yourself opening one app after another without remembering why, watching something you never planned to watch, reading something that did not matter, or chasing thoughts that led nowhere. And afterward, you felt drained, slightly irritated, maybe even guilty for wasting time. But what if that moment was not simply poor discipline or a lack of focus? What if that sudden cloud of distraction was actually a deliberate interference designed to block a message that was meant for you? In spiritual warfare, silence is powerful, but noise can be even more strategic. The enemy rarely needs to destroy a message if he can simply drown it out. All he must do is fill the environment with enough distraction that the signal cannot be heard. That is how jamming works. In communication systems, a signal jammer floods a channel with static so that the real transmission becomes impossible to recognize. And something very similar can happen within the human mind and spirit. The moment a divine message begins to approach the atmosphere around your attention, becomes filled with interruptions, anxieties, impulses, and emotional turbulence. Suddenly you feel restless. Suddenly, everything demands your attention. Suddenly your mind is louder than it was moments before. And by the time the noise settles, the moment of clarity has already passed. This is why the strange fog you experienced earlier matters more than you realize. It may not have been random at all. It may have been the evidence of a spiritual battle taking place over your attention. Heaven was attempting to speak, and interference rushed in to prevent the message from landing. Yet here is the encouraging truth you must understand before we go any further. The message was not canceled. It was only delayed. God does not abandon a transmission simply because noise tried to interrupt it. The signal remains active. The message still exists. The connection can still be restored. That is why this moment matters. This message you are hearing right now is not just information. It is an invitation to step back into alignment with the signal that was already reaching for you. The fog can lift, the noise can fade, and when it does, the clarity that seemed lost can return stronger than before. The purpose of what you are about to hear is simple but powerful. First, you will understand what truly happened during those confusing moments earlier. Second, you will learn how to recognize when interference is taking place again. And finally, you will rediscover how to restore the connection, so the message meant for your life can finally arrive with the clarity it was always intended to carry. Because chosen one, you were never meant to live surrounded by static. You were designed to receive the signal dot, the divine knock, and the misinterpreted pressure begins with a deeper understanding of a moment many people have misunderstood their entire lives. Earlier, you felt something unusual rising inside you, something difficult to explain in ordinary language. Perhaps it appeared as tension in your chest, tightness in your jaw, or a subtle restlessness in your thoughts that refused to settle. Your first instinct may have been to label it as anxiety, stress, or mental exhaustion. That is the language the modern world has trained you to use. Every sensation must be categorized as psychological, chemical, or emotional. Yet the scriptures reveal another dimension of that experience, one that has been quietly present long before modern explanations attempted to replace it. In Revelation 3:20, a verse repeated so often that many people think they already understand it. There is a statement that carries far more depth than it appears on the surface. The words are simple: "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." For generations, people have imagined this moment as gentle and polite, like a visitor tapping softly on a wooden door, patiently waiting for someone to answer. But when we look at the original language of the text, something remarkable begins to emerge. The Greek word used for knock in that verse is the word kruo. And kruo does not simply describe a quiet tapping sound. It describes a striking motion that creates vibration. It carries the sense of pressure, resonance, and movement that can be felt even before it is clearly heard. Imagine someone standing on the other side of a door so close that the wood itself begins to tremble slightly under their presence. You might not hear the first contact with your ears, but you feel it through the structure around you. This is the kind of knocking the verse is describing. It is not merely a polite request for attention. It is the sensation of presence pressing against the threshold of your awareness. When this happens spiritually, the body sometimes responds before the mind understands what is occurring. The nervous system senses pressure. The chest tightens slightly. The breath becomes shallow for a moment. And the mind searches for a logical explanation. Because the modern world has removed spiritual language from everyday understanding, the brain often misinterprets this sensation as anxiety. The moment your body begins reacting to that pressure, your thoughts rush in to interpret it using the categories you have learned from your environment. You might think something is wrong with you. You might believe you are overwhelmed or mentally tired. You might even criticize yourself for being weak or unfocused. But what if the pressure you felt earlier was not the signal of something breaking inside you? What if it was the signal of something sacred approaching you? The ancient writers understood that divine encounters often carried a physical awareness that preceded understanding. The human spirit recognizes presence long before the intellect can label it. That pressure in your chest may not have been the beginning of panic at all. It may have been the beginning of contact. The weight you felt was not a problem to escape, but a presence attempting to be recognized. Yet here is where the interference often begins. The moment that sacred signal approaches your awareness, another voice tries to reinterpret it before you can understand it correctly. Instead of recognizing the moment as spiritual, the mind begins to accuse itself. Thoughts appear such as "you are distracted," You are wasting time, you are not disciplined enough, you are failing again. This sudden wave of self-criticism does not arrive by accident. It is part of a subtle strategy designed to redirect your attention away from the signal itself. If your focus shifts toward guilt and frustration, the original sensation becomes buried under layers of emotional noise. The enemy does not always need to silence God's presence completely. Sometimes all that is required is convincing you that what you are feeling has nothing to do with God at all. If you believe the sensation is simply anxiety, you will try to escape it rather than listen to it. If you believe it is laziness, you will condemn yourself instead of becoming curious about the moment. If you believe it is stress, you will try to distract yourself with activity until the feeling fades. In each of these responses, the result is the same. The door remains closed not because God stopped knocking, but because the meaning of the knock was misunderstood. That is why this moment of realization matters so deeply. You are being invited to reinterpret what happened earlier through a different lens. Instead of replaying the last 2 hours as a story of distraction or failure, consider the possibility that something sacred brushed against your awareness. That strange pressure was not a warning sign of collapse, but the vibration of presence standing near the doorway of your consciousness. God was not distant in that moment. He was closer than you realized. And the confusion that followed was not evidence that you missed your chance forever. It was simply the noise created when something holy tries to enter a world that has trained the mind to ignore it. So the first step forward is not complicated, but it is deeply important. Stop accusing yourself. Stop replaying those moments with frustration or shame. The enemy thrives when the heart becomes its own accuser, because self-condemnation keeps your attention locked in the wrong direction. Instead, allow a new understanding to replace that narrative. What you experienced earlier may have been the beginning of a divine knock, a vibration of presence pressing gently but powerfully against the doorway of your spirit. And the fact that you are hearing this now suggests something remarkable. The knocking has not stopped. The signal is still present, and the door you thought you had already missed the chance to open may still be waiting quietly in front of you. The battle for your timing unfolds when you return to that small moment that seemed insignificant at first, but now begins to reveal its deeper meaning. Think again about what you were about to do before the fog of distraction settled in. Perhaps you reached for your phone with a sincere intention. Maybe you planned to read a Bible verse, send a prayer request, or take a brief moment to center your thoughts before continuing your day. It was not a dramatic spiritual ritual. It was something simple, quiet, and sincere. Yet it was precisely in that ordinary moment that the interruption appeared. A notification slid down the screen. A video began playing automatically. A headline caught your eye. One click led to another, and what was supposed to take 30 seconds somehow stretched into several minutes. Then those minutes quietly multiplied. You scrolled a little further, watched a little longer, read something else that seemed unrelated to your original intention. By the time you looked up again, 20 minutes had disappeared. Perhaps even more. And the strange part was not just the loss of time. It was the feeling that followed. Instead of clarity, there was fatigue. Instead of peace, there was a subtle irritation. Instead of feeling closer to God, you felt further away from the very purpose that led you to pick up the phone in the first place. Many people would dismiss this moment as a common modern problem. After all, digital distraction is everywhere. Social media platforms, notifications, endless streams of content all compete for attention every second of the day. But there is a deeper layer beneath this pattern that most people never stop to examine. The enemy is rarely interested in stealing your time itself. Time by itself is not the true battlefield. The real battle is fought over your timing. A person can lose 20 minutes and recover them later through discipline, productivity, or planning. But when a moment of divine timing passes unnoticed, the opportunity connected to that moment can shift in ways that are far more difficult to recover. That is why certain interruptions seem strangely coordinated. They appear precisely when your attention is about to align with something meaningful. Just as you are about to pray, something distracts you. Just as you are about to reflect, something pulls your focus away. Just as you are about to receive insight, your mind becomes scattered. These interruptions are rarely random. They are strategic, because there are moments when heaven releases instructions that are meant to arrive within a very specific window of awareness. When that window opens, clarity is available in ways that cannot always be replicated later with the same intensity. And it was during one of those windows that your attention became the target of interference. The reason the enemy reacted so aggressively in that moment is not because he feared your prayer alone. It is because of what that prayer was about to unlock. God was not merely inviting you into a comforting moment of reflection. He was preparing to deliver direction for your next season. There are seasons in life when growth happens gradually through experience and learning. But there are also seasons when a single insight can shift the entire trajectory of a person's path. One revelation can change how you see your calling, your work, your relationships, and the decisions you make from that point forward. The message attempting to reach you carried that kind of potential. It was not just encouragement, it was instruction. It contained the beginning outline of what your next assignment would require. And that is exactly why interference appeared so quickly. The enemy understands that when a person receives clarity about their assignment, confusion loses its power. When someone understands the direction they are meant to walk, many of the traps designed to delay them no longer work. Purpose has a way of exposing distractions for what they truly are. And that makes clarity extremely dangerous to any force that benefits from keeping you uncertain about your direction. So the strategy was simple. If the message could not be destroyed, it could at least be delayed. All that was necessary was to flood your attention with enough noise that the transmission would pass by unnoticed. Notifications, videos, headlines, thoughts, emotional loops, all became part of the same fog, designed to keep your focus unstable. By the time the noise faded, the moment of alignment had already passed. Yet here is the truth that changes everything. Timing can be delayed, but it is not easily erased when God is the one initiating the message. The blueprint that was moving toward you earlier still exists. The instructions for your next season have not disappeared into silence. They are still hovering at the edge of your awareness, waiting for the moment when your attention becomes clear enough to receive them. And that is why this realization matters so deeply right now. What seemed like a small moment of distraction may actually have been the opening scene of a much larger battle over the direction of your future. The enemy was not afraid of a few minutes of prayer. He was afraid of the blueprint those minutes were about to unlock. The frequency battlefield becomes clearer when you begin to understand that the struggle you are experiencing is not only emotional or spiritual, but also deeply connected to the way the human mind itself functions. Your brain is not simply a collection of thoughts floating randomly through your head. It operates more like a receiver and transmitter, constantly processing signals, filtering information, and aligning itself with certain patterns of mental activity. In many ways, it behaves like a radio tuned to specific stations. A radio does not create music on its own. It simply aligns itself with the frequency that is already broadcasting through the air. If the dial is tuned to the correct station, the signal arrives clearly and the sound becomes recognizable. But if the dial is even slightly misaligned, the music disappears into static. The broadcast may still be present, powerful, and steady, yet the listener hears only noise because the receiver is not synchronized with the signal being transmitted. Something very similar happens within the human mind. Neuroscience has shown that the brain functions through measurable wave patterns that shift depending on the state of consciousness a person is experiencing. Among these patterns, one of the most dominant in modern life is the beta state. Beta is the frequency of activity, urgency, and survival. When your brain is operating in beta, your thoughts move quickly. Your attention jumps from one task to another. Your body becomes alert, ready to respond to problems, deadlines, and pressures. In this state, the mind is scanning constantly for threats, responsibilities, and decisions that require immediate action. Beta is useful in certain situations. If a person is facing danger, solving a problem under pressure, or navigating a complex task that demands quick reactions, beta becomes the brain's way of sharpening focus and mobilizing energy. But the problem is that the modern world rarely allows the mind to leave this state. Notifications, deadlines, traffic conversations, financial concerns, and endless streams of digital information keep the brain locked in a constant cycle of alertness. Even when nothing dangerous is happening, the mind remains tense, as if it must be ready to react at any moment. The result is that many people spend most of their waking hours living inside a mental environment designed for emergency response rather than spiritual awareness. And this is where the misunderstanding begins, because while the human mind may spend much of its time operating in beta, the voice of God does not typically arrive through that same frequency. Divine communication has always been associated with a different mental atmosphere, one that ancient prophets, mystics, and spiritual teachers described long before modern science gave it a name. This state is often referred to as the theta frequency. Theta is the rhythm of stillness, deep reflection, creativity, and spiritual sensitivity. It is the quiet mental space that appears when the body relaxes and the mind stops racing long enough to listen. In theta, the noise of urgency fades and awareness becomes receptive rather than reactive. It is the threshold between the conscious mind and the deeper layers of perception where insight and revelation often emerge. When prophets withdrew into solitude, when Jesus stepped away from the crowds to pray in quiet places, when sages meditated in silence for long periods of time, they were intentionally moving their minds away from the chaos of beta into the receptive stillness that theta provides. It is within that calm environment that subtle signals can finally be recognized. But here is where the battlefield becomes visible. If God is speaking from the quiet channel of theta, while the human mind is trapped in the loud urgency of beta, the result is not silence from heaven. The result is interference. The signal is present, but the receiver cannot interpret it clearly. Imagine trying to listen to a delicate whisper while standing next to a roaring highway. The whisper may still exist, but the surrounding noise makes it almost impossible to distinguish. In the same way, when the mind remains locked in stress and constant stimulation, divine communication can sound like nothing more than mental static. Thoughts become scattered. Intuition feels uncertain. Spiritual awareness fades behind layers of urgency and distraction. From the outside, it appears as if God is silent. Many people conclude that heaven has stopped speaking or that they have somehow lost their connection to the divine. But the real issue is often much simpler and far more hopeful than that conclusion suggests. The silence is not coming from God. The silence is being created by misalignment. The signal is still broadcasting steady and patient, waiting for the moment when the receiver adjusts its frequency enough to recognize it again. And this realization changes the entire perspective on what you experienced earlier. The confusion, the restlessness, the mental fog were not signs that the message had disappeared. They were signs that your internal receiver had been pushed into a state where the signal could not yet be clearly understood. The battlefield was not outside you, but within the alignment of your own attention. Once the mind begins shifting away from the chaos of beta and toward the quiet awareness of theta, something remarkable begins to happen. What once sounded like static slowly becomes recognizable as meaning. What once felt like confusion begins transforming into clarity. And the voice that seemed distant suddenly feels as if it had been speaking all along, waiting patiently for you to tune in. Biblical proof of the quiet frequency becomes clearer when we step back into one of the most powerful moments recorded in Scripture, a moment that reveals exactly how divine communication actually works. In the book of 1 Kings chapter 19, we encounter the prophet Elijah during one of the most exhausted seasons of his life. Elijah had just experienced an intense spiritual confrontation on Mount Carmel, where fire fell from heaven, proving God's power before an entire nation. But immediately after that victory, Elijah fled into the wilderness, overwhelmed by fear, fatigue, and emotional collapse. He had seen miracles, yet his mind was now filled with anxiety and discouragement. Many people can relate to this moment more than they realize. There are seasons when even those who have witnessed God's power begin to feel lost inside the noise of their own thoughts and circumstances. Elijah eventually finds himself standing on a mountain, waiting for God to speak. What happens next is one of the most fascinating demonstrations of spiritual perception in the entire Bible. First, there comes a powerful wind that tears through the mountains so violent that rocks begin to break apart under its force. Imagine standing there as the air itself roars like a storm tearing across the landscape. It would certainly feel like the kind of dramatic moment where God might appear. Yet the scripture says something unexpected. The Lord was not in the wind. After the wind comes an earthquake, the ground trembling beneath Elijah's feet, as the earth itself begins to shake. In ancient times, earthquakes were often interpreted as signs of divine activity, moments when heaven was believed to be intervening in human affairs. Yet again, the text tells us something surprising. The Lord was not in the earthquake. Then comes fire, the very element that had just demonstrated God's power on Mount Carmel. Flames move through the scene, dramatic and intense, the kind of spectacle that captures human attention immediately. But even in that moment, the scripture says once again, the Lord was not in the fire. If we look at this sequence through the lens of what we now understand about mental states, something remarkable becomes visible. Wind, earthquakes, and fire all represent chaos, intensity, urgency, and overwhelming stimulation. They are dramatic, loud, and impossible to ignore. In modern terms, they resemble the same mental environment that defines the beta state of the mind. Beta is full of urgency, noise, and powerful emotional reactions. It captures attention quickly because it feels intense and immediate. Yet Elijah's story reveals that intensity alone does not mean divine communication is present. After the wind fades, after the earthquake settles, after the fire disappears, something entirely different enters the scene. The text describes it as a still, small voice. Some translations describe it as a gentle whisper, others as a soft, murmuring sound, barely noticeable at first. This moment is quiet, subtle, and almost easy to miss if Elijah had remained focused on the dramatic events that came before it. But this is the moment when God finally speaks, not through the violence of the storm, not through the trembling of the earth, not through the spectacle of fire, but through a whisper that can only be heard when everything else becomes silent. This is one of the clearest spiritual illustrations of the frequency principle. Divine communication does not compete with chaos. It waits for quiet. The whisper represents the calm, receptive mental state that allows subtle signals to be recognized. It mirrors the same mental environment associated with the theta frequency, where stillness replaces urgency and awareness becomes deep enough to perceive what loud noise would normally hide. The tragedy for many people today is that they spend most of their lives searching for God inside the wind, the earthquakes, and the fire of their circumstances. They expect divine guidance to appear through dramatic emotional surges, overwhelming signs, or intense moments of crisis. When their lives become chaotic, they assume that somewhere inside that chaos, God must be shouting instructions loudly enough to be heard. But Elijah's experience teaches the opposite lesson. The louder the environment becomes, the more difficult it becomes to hear the voice that actually matters. God was never absent during the storm, but the storm itself was not where his voice was located. His voice waited patiently on the other side of the noise, speaking softly enough that only a quiet mind could recognize it. This understanding transforms the way a person approaches spiritual clarity. Instead of chasing louder signs, the wiser path becomes creating space for stillness. Instead of searching for answers inside emotional turbulence, the heart learns to withdraw into quiet awareness, where subtle insight can surface. Elijah did not receive guidance by analyzing the chaos around him. He received it by remaining present long enough for the whisper to emerge. In the same way, learning to tune into the correct frequency is not about forcing revelation to appear. It is about allowing the noise to settle so that what has been speaking quietly all along can finally be heard with unmistakable clarity. The 3 signs of spiritual jamming becomes easier to understand once you recognize that spiritual interference rarely announces itself in dramatic ways. Most of the time it hides inside ordinary experiences that seem psychological, emotional, or even technological. Yet when viewed with spiritual awareness, these experiences begin to form a recognizable pattern. Just as a technician diagnosing a disrupted signal first looks for specific symptoms, you can learn to recognize when interference is occurring within your own attention and awareness. The purpose of this understanding is not to create fear or suspicion about every distraction you encounter during the day. Rather, it is to develop a kind of spiritual literacy, the ability to notice when the atmosphere around your focus has been disturbed in ways that seem strangely coordinated. When divine communication begins approaching your awareness, the environment of your thoughts often becomes unusually unstable. Certain patterns appear repeatedly, almost like warning lights on the dashboard of a vehicle. One of the first signs is something that can be described as phantom vibration. You may have experienced this sensation many times without realizing its deeper significance. Your phone is in your pocket or sitting nearby, and suddenly you feel the urge to check it. You are certain for the moment that it vibrated or that a notification appeared. Yet when you pick it up, there is nothing there. No message, no alert, no reason for the interruption you just felt. Many people treat this as a harmless side effect of living in a digital world. But spiritually speaking, phantom vibration can sometimes reveal a deeper confusion of signals. Your spirit senses that communication is occurring, that something meaningful is trying to reach your awareness. But because the modern world has trained your attention to expect information through screens and devices, your mind instinctively searches for the signal in the wrong place. You check your phone when the real message is not digital at all. The signal is coming from a quieter source, one that requires stillness rather than scrolling to recognize. The second sign appears within the landscape of your thoughts and can be described as the loop of doom. This is the experience of a single negative memory worry or conversation replaying repeatedly inside your mind. Perhaps it is an argument you had earlier in the week. Perhaps it is a financial concern, an embarrassing mistake, or a fear about the future. You attempt to shift your attention toward prayer reflection or creative thought, but the mind keeps snapping back to the same scene as if a record were stuck in a groove. The more you try to move forward, the more that same thought insists on repeating itself. In spiritual terms, these emotional loops can function as powerful jamming signals. The enemy understands that revelation requires mental space to land. Insight often arrives quietly, like a bird searching for a place to rest. But if the mind is already crowded with repetitive emotional noise, there is no clear place for that insight to settle. So the same memory keeps replaying, not necessarily because it is important, but because its repetition prevents anything new from entering the conversation happening inside your mind. The third sign is often the most surprising because it appears through emotional reactions that seem completely unrelated to spiritual matters. This sign can be described as sudden irritation. Imagine feeling disproportionately frustrated by small and harmless events. The sound of someone chewing becomes unbearable. A traffic light changing too slowly triggers impatience. A simple question from a coworker or family member sparks a reaction that feels stronger than the situation deserves. Immediately afterward, you may even wonder why you responded that way. In many cases, this kind of irritation is not actually about the external situation at all. Instead, it can be the emotional friction created when two different frequencies collide. Your spirit may be attempting to rise toward a quieter and more receptive state, while your environment continues pulling your mind back into urgency, noise, and distraction. The tension between these two directions generates emotional heat, and that heat often escapes through irritability. What appears to be anger toward the outside world is sometimes just the pressure created by conflicting signals within your awareness. When you step back and look at these three signs together, a pattern becomes visible. Phantom vibration reveals a misdirected search for communication. The loop of doom reveals mental noise preventing new insight from landing. Sudden irritation reveals emotional friction between inner stillness and external chaos. None of these experiences automatically means that spiritual interference is present every time they occur. Yet when they appear together or intensify during moments when you are trying to focus spiritually, they can indicate something important. They suggest that your spirit and your environment may be operating on different frequencies at the same time. Your spirit may be reaching upward toward clarity, while the world around you pulls your attention downward toward noise. Recognizing this conflict is not a sign of weakness. It is actually the first step toward reclaiming control over your attention and allowing the signal that was meant for you to finally be heard clearly. Why the modern world keeps you disconnected becomes clearer when you compare the rhythm of life today with the rhythm that existed during the eras when many of the great spiritual revelations in Scripture occurred. When you read about prophets, mystics, and seekers throughout history, you often discover a pattern that feels almost impossible by modern standards. These individuals frequently withdrew from crowded environments and entered long seasons of silence. They walked into deserts, climbed mountains, sat beside quiet rivers, or retreated into caves where the noise of civilization could no longer reach them. Moses spent extended time alone on Mount Sinai. Elijah withdrew into wilderness places before hearing the whisper of God. Jesus himself often stepped away from crowds to pray in solitude during the night. These moments were not accidental details within the narrative. They were intentional conditions created so the human mind could move away from chaos and into the stillness where divine communication becomes recognizable. Silence was not simply a spiritual preference. It was a practical requirement for tuning the mind into a receptive state. When external noise fades and the body relaxes, the mental turbulence that dominates everyday awareness begins to slow down. Thoughts that once raced suddenly become quieter. Emotional tension softens. Attention becomes more stable. In that environment, the mind naturally shifts toward deeper frequencies of awareness, where insight, intuition, and spiritual perception become accessible. In ancient environments, This shift was far easier to achieve because daily life moved at a slower and more predictable pace. People lived closer to the rhythms of nature. The sun rising and setting structured their days. The absence of constant technological stimulation allowed the mind to drift into reflective states more naturally. But the world you live in now operates very differently. The modern environment has been engineered in ways that constantly compete for your attention. From the moment you wake up until the moment you fall asleep, signals surround you from every direction. Phones vibrate, screens glow, messages arrive, notifications flash, and entire industries are designed around capturing and holding your focus for as long as possible. Information flows continuously, rarely allowing the mind to settle long enough to process what it has already received. Even moments that appear quiet on the surface often contain invisible streams of stimulation that keep the brain alert and restless. A person may sit alone in a room, yet still remain connected to dozens of conversations, updates, headlines, and digital interactions happening at the same time. The result is a mental environment that rarely leaves the beta state. Instead of moving naturally between activity and reflection, the mind becomes trapped in constant urgency. Responsibilities add even more pressure to this environment. Work demands attention. Family obligations require energy. Financial concerns create underlying tension. Social expectations encourage constant communication and responsiveness. Every part of life begins to feel like it must be handled quickly and efficiently. Under these conditions, stillness begins to feel unnatural. If a moment of quiet appears, the mind often rushes to fill it immediately with another task or another source of stimulation. Silence can even begin to feel uncomfortable because the brain has grown accustomed to constant input. But here is the truth that changes the entire perspective on spiritual disconnection. The difficulty you experience in hearing God clearly does not mean God has become distant. It simply means the channel through which you are listening has become crowded with noise. Imagine standing in a room where 10 different radios are playing simultaneously. Each one is broadcasting a different station. The music from each channel overlaps with the others until the entire room becomes a mixture of sound that is impossible to understand. The stations themselves are still broadcasting clearly, but the environment has become too noisy to distinguish one signal from another. This is what the modern world often does to the human mind. It fills the atmosphere of attention with so many signals that the quieter frequencies become difficult to recognize. Yet the voice of God has not stopped speaking. The broadcast continues steadily patient and unchanging. What has changed is the condition of the receiver. This is why one of the most profound instructions in the Bible is also one of the simplest. Psalm 46:10 declares, "Be still and know that I am God." At first glance, these words appear poetic, almost symbolic. But when you look closely at the original Hebrew language, the instruction becomes far more practical and physical than many people realize. The phrase translated as "be still" comes from the Hebrew word rapha. This word carries the meaning of letting go, relaxing, releasing tension, or allowing the body to go slack. It is not merely a command to stop speaking. It is an invitation to release the internal pressure that keeps the mind constantly striving and reacting. In other words, stillness is not just silence in the environment. It is relaxation in the nervous system. It is the moment when the mind stops gripping every problem and allows itself to rest. When that release happens, something subtle begins to change inside the brain. The rapid urgency of beta slowly softens. The mental waves begin shifting toward deeper rhythms of awareness. And in that quieter state, signals that once sounded like distant static suddenly become recognizable again. The instruction to be still is therefore not a passive suggestion. It is a spiritual strategy. It is the doorway through which the mind steps out of the chaos of constant stimulation and into the calm environment where divine communication becomes clear. God has not moved further away from you in the modern world. The signal has not weakened or disappeared. The only real challenge is that the noise surrounding your attention has grown louder. But the moment you begin reclaiming stillness, even for a few minutes at a time, you start moving back toward the channel where that signal has been waiting for you all along. To the back door to spiritual clarity begins with an idea that may feel surprising at first, especially after everything we have explored about stillness, ancient prophets, and the difficulty of reaching that quiet, spiritual state in the modern world. For a long time, it seemed as though the only path toward hearing God clearly required extreme discipline. Long periods of solitude and years of training the mind to slow down. Many spiritual traditions describe this journey almost like climbing a mountain that only a few people ever reached. Prophets withdrew into deserts. Monks spent decades practicing silence. Mystics dedicated their lives to learning how to quiet the noise of their thoughts. When people today hear about those practices, they often feel discouraged because their lives simply do not allow for that kind of withdrawal. You have responsibilities, obligations, families, work schedules, and environments that rarely stop demanding your attention. The idea of disappearing into a cave for weeks just to reach the mental state where God's voice becomes clear feels unrealistic in a world that expects constant movement. Yet here is where something remarkable begins to emerge. What if the same clarity those ancient seekers found through long periods of silence could be accessed through a different doorway, one that works with the design of the human brain rather than against it? What if there was a way to help your mind move toward the correct frequency without requiring years of struggle and effort? To understand how this might be possible, you need to consider a simple but powerful principle that exists throughout the natural world. This principle is known as sympathetic resonance. Imagine placing two tuning forks in the same room. Each fork is designed to vibrate at a specific pitch. If you strike one tuning fork so that it begins vibrating, something fascinating happens. The second tuning fork, even if it has not been touched, will begin vibrating as well if it is tuned to the same frequency. The energy from the first fork moves through the air and causes the second fork to synchronize with it. This phenomenon happens because objects naturally seek harmony with frequencies that match their own structure. The same principle can apply to the human brain. Your mind was designed to respond to patterns of rhythm and sound. From the moment you were born, your brain learned to synchronize with external signals. The heartbeat you heard while developing in the womb created your first rhythm of awareness. The voices and sounds around you shaped how your brain learned to process information. Throughout life, your mind continues responding to patterns that influence its state of activity. When the environment is loud and chaotic, your brain accelerates into the urgency of beta. But when it encounters rhythms associated with calm repetition and harmony, it can begin slowing down toward deeper states of awareness. This is where the idea of a back door to spiritual clarity begins to make sense. Instead of forcing the brain into stillness through sheer willpower, external sound frequencies can gently guide the mind toward the state where stillness occurs naturally. It is similar to the way the second tuning fork begins vibrating when the first one is struck. The brain recognizes the pattern and gradually aligns itself with it. This process is often referred to as entrainment, a scientific term describing how rhythmic stimuli can influence brainwave activity. When the brain hears sound patterns designed to reflect the slower rhythm of theta, it begins shifting toward that same state. The transition does not happen through effort or concentration. It happens because the brain was built to synchronize with harmonious signals, This idea may sound modern, but in reality, it echoes something deeply ancient about the human mind. Studies have shown that young children naturally spend much of their time in the theta state. This is one reason children often appear imaginative, spiritually receptive, and deeply curious about the world around them. Their minds have not yet been trained to live inside constant urgency. As people grow older, responsibilities, stress, and environmental pressure gradually push the brain toward faster and more reactive patterns of activity. Over time, the natural rhythm of theta becomes less accessible not because it disappeared, but because it was buried under layers of mental noise. The purpose of tools designed around brainwave entrainment is simply to remind the brain of that original rhythm. They do not create something artificial. Instead, they help restore a state that once existed naturally within you. When the mind begins returning to that quieter frequency, the environment of your thoughts changes dramatically. The constant rush of mental chatter begins to slow. Emotional tension softens. Awareness becomes deeper and more receptive. In that environment, the subtle signals that once felt distant begin to emerge again with surprising clarity. The tool being introduced here is not meant to replace prayer, faith, or spiritual discipline. Instead, it functions like clearing fog from a windshield so that the path ahead becomes visible. When the noise surrounding your mind decreases, the spiritual connection that seemed blocked often reveals that it was present the entire time. By helping your brain re-enter the calm frequency it once knew naturally, this method becomes a practical way to reduce interference and restore the receptive space where insight, guidance, and divine communication can finally be heard again. The real message God was trying to send begins to reveal itself only after the noise that surrounded your mind starts to settle. Earlier, you may have felt as if something important was trying to reach you, but never fully arrived. The distraction, the fog, the emotional pressure all combined to block the clarity that should have followed that moment. Yet once the static begins to fade and the mind returns to a quieter state, something remarkable happens. The message that once felt distant does not need to be recreated or invented. It simply becomes visible again, like words appearing clearly once the interference disappears from a radio signal. Divine communication rarely disappears entirely. It waits patiently on the other side of the noise until the moment your attention becomes calm enough to receive it. And when that moment arrives, the realization that follows often carries more weight than you expected. Because the message that was approaching you earlier was not simply a word of comfort or encouragement. It was an announcement of change. Not a small adjustment, not a minor improvement in your current path, but something deeper and more significant. God was not preparing to give you a promotion within the same season you have been living in. He was preparing to issue a reassignment. A promotion allows a person to continue operating within familiar structures while gaining greater responsibility or recognition. But a reassignment is different. A reassignment means the environment changes. The expectations change. The tools that worked before may no longer apply. The mission itself moves into a different direction. When this kind of transition begins unfolding, it often feels unsettling at first, because the mind instinctively tries to rely on patterns that once produced success. You remember the habits that helped you overcome earlier challenges. You recall the strategies that opened doors in the past. You think about the relationships that supported your growth during previous seasons. Yet slowly, it becomes clear that the same keys that once unlocked progress no longer fit the doors in front of you now. Conversations that once felt energizing begin to feel draining. Methods that once brought clarity begin producing confusion. Opportunities that once seemed essential begin fading quietly into the background. This shift does not mean those earlier experiences were mistakes. They were necessary training for the season you have already completed. But the assignment that is approaching requires a different level of alignment. And that alignment often begins with the uncomfortable realization that familiar strategies will not carry you forward forever. It is at this moment that many people begin feeling something that looks like fear. A knot forms in the stomach. Questions begin circulating through the mind. Thoughts appear such as, "Who am I to do this?" or "What if I am not ready for what is coming next?" This feeling can be surprisingly intense because reassignment requires stepping into territory where the outcome cannot be fully predicted in advance. Yet this emotional reaction is not unique to your situation. Scripture shows us that even some of the most significant figures in biblical history experienced the same hesitation when they encountered their calling. One of the clearest examples appears in the story of Moses in Exodus chapter 4. When God first revealed the assignment that Moses was meant to carry, the response was not confident acceptance. Moses immediately began pointing out reasons why he believed he was the wrong person for the task. He questioned his ability to speak clearly. He questioned his authority. He questioned whether anyone would even listen to him. The internal dialogue of doubt sounded remarkably similar to the thoughts many people experience when they sense that a new season of responsibility is approaching. Yet God's response to Moses reveals something profound about how divine calling actually works. God did not search for someone who already appeared perfectly qualified by human standards. Instead, he responded by reminding Moses who had created his abilities in the first place. The focus shifted away from Moses' limitations and toward the source of the power that would operate through him. In other words, the calling did not depend on Moses already being capable. It depended on Moses being willing to move forward despite feeling incapable. This reframes the doubts you may be experiencing in a completely different light. What you are feeling right now is not evidence that you have been misidentified for the assignment. In many cases, it is evidence that the assignment is genuine. If you felt completely confident in your own ability to handle what is coming next, the risk would be that you might begin believing the success belonged entirely to you. But when humility appears in the form of hesitation or uncertainty, it keeps the heart aligned with the understanding that the strength required for the mission does not originate from your own resources alone. Your sense of inadequacy becomes a kind of safeguard that protects the purpose from being distorted by pride. The enemy often tries to twist that humility into a weapon by turning it into discouragement. Thoughts appear suggesting that your fear means you are not chosen or that someone else would be more qualified. But the pattern throughout Scripture repeatedly shows the opposite. Those who feel the weight of responsibility most deeply are often the very ones being prepared for it. The doubt does not cancel the calling. It reminds you that the power behind the assignment must come from a source greater than your own confidence. And that realization is precisely what prepares a person to carry the kind of responsibility that a reassignment requires. Aligning with the new assignment begins at the moment when understanding turns into action. Hearing that a reassignment is approaching is one thing, but stepping into alignment with that new direction is another experience entirely. As soon as you begin moving toward the clarity that has been revealed, something often changes in the atmosphere around you. Instead of life suddenly becoming easier, resistance can sometimes intensify. Situations that once felt manageable begin producing unusual pressure. Unexpected interruptions appear. Emotional tension increases in moments when you are trying to focus or pray. At first, this can feel discouraging, as if something has gone wrong, just when you thought you were beginning to move in the right direction. But in many cases, this resistance is not a sign of failure at all. It is the natural reaction that occurs whenever a person begins shifting away from confusion and toward clarity. The enemy understands that once someone aligns themselves with their assignment, Many of the strategies designed to delay them lose their effectiveness. A distracted mind is easy to steer. A mind anchored in purpose is far more difficult to manipulate. That is why the moment you begin taking your alignment seriously, the pressure of distraction often increases. Urgent problems suddenly demand attention. Emotional conflicts appear out of nowhere. Thoughts filled with anxiety or doubt attempt to reclaim your focus. The goal is simple: to drag your mind back into the chaotic state where the signal becomes difficult to hear again. But understanding this pattern allows you to respond differently. Instead of interpreting these moments as evidence that something is going wrong, you can recognize them as attempts to pull you away from the clarity you have already begun to access. When you maintain your alignment despite those pressures, something powerful begins unfolding. Your mind becomes more stable. Your attention stops chasing every urgent distraction. And gradually, the environment within your thoughts becomes quiet enough for deeper insight to surface. There is a story that illustrates this process in a way that many people can recognize. A woman named Sarah ran a small consulting business that had reached a difficult season. For years, she had been working tirelessly, putting in long hours every day, trying to solve problems through sheer effort and determination. She woke up early, answered messages, constantly responded to every demand that appeared on her schedule, and pushed herself to keep moving, even when exhaustion began creeping into her mind. From the outside, it looked like dedication, but internally, she felt trapped in a cycle of constant urgency. Every decision seemed rushed. Every solution felt temporary. The harder she worked, the more overwhelmed she became. Eventually, she reached a point where she realized that the noise surrounding her thoughts had become so intense that she could barely think clearly anymore. That was when she encountered the concept of mental frequency and alignment. At first, the idea seemed almost too simple to matter. Instead of beginning her day immediately with emails, phone calls, and problem-solving, she decided to spend a few minutes each morning bringing her mind into a calm and receptive state before engaging with the outside world. She sat quietly, allowed her breathing to slow, and used sound patterns designed to guide her brain into the deeper frequency where clarity becomes easier to access. For the first few days, nothing dramatic happened. Her business problems still existed, and the same responsibilities waited for her after those few minutes of quiet. But something subtle began changing within her awareness. By the fourth morning, while sitting in that calm state, a phrase suddenly surfaced in her mind with surprising clarity: blue ocean. The words seemed random at first, but they carried a sense of significance she could not ignore. Instead of dismissing the idea, she began researching the concept of blue ocean strategy, a business approach focused on creating new markets instead of competing inside crowded ones. As she explored the concept, she realized that her company had been fighting within an overcrowded industry where every competitor offered nearly identical services. Inspired by the idea that surfaced during that quiet moment, she began redesigning her approach to focus on a niche that few others had considered. The shift did not happen overnight, but over the next several months, the results became undeniable. The new strategy opened opportunities that had never appeared during the years she spent working longer hours and chasing urgent solutions. Within 6 months, her company's revenue had tripled, not because she worked harder, but because she began operating from clarity rather than chaos. The breakthrough did not come from pushing her mind into exhaustion. It came from creating the mental environment where the right insight could finally be heard. The lesson hidden inside that story reaches far beyond business decisions. It reveals something fundamental about how divine guidance often operates. Solutions frequently exist long before we recognize them. Opportunities hover just beyond the edge of our awareness. But when the mind remains trapped in urgency and stress, those insights cannot land. They pass quietly above the noise of our thoughts without ever becoming visible. The moment the mental posture changes, the signal that was already present suddenly becomes clear. This is why aligning with your new assignment is not only about effort or determination. It is about protecting the environment of your mind so that the guidance connected to your purpose can arrive without interference. The commissioning of the chosen one arrives at the moment where everything you have heard stops being information and becomes a decision. Throughout this message, you have traced the path of a signal that tried to reach you, a message that approached your awareness but was briefly buried under layers of distraction, noise, and confusion. You have seen how the mind can become trapped in frequencies that distort what heaven is trying to communicate. You have recognized the subtle strategies that attempt to jam the connection and redirect your attention away from the clarity meant for your life. But now something different is happening. The static has been explained. The fog has begun to lift. And what remains is not uncertainty, but invitation. This is the point where the message moves from explanation into activation. Imagine for a moment that you are no longer sitting where you are now, but standing in a quiet place within your spirit. The noise of the outside world fades behind you. The thoughts that once rushed through your mind begin slowing until they settle into calm awareness. In this stillness, picture yourself standing upright with clarity and intention. Your shoulders are no longer weighed down by confusion. Your breath becomes steady. In your mind's eye, you recognize that you are standing in the presence of the one who has been knocking at the door of your awareness all along. Not as a distant force, not as an abstract idea, but as a presence that has been patiently waiting for your attention to become clear enough to recognize it. This is the moment of commissioning. Throughout history, moments like this marked the transition between preparation and assignment. Prophets stood before God and received their calling. Disciples heard the words that sent them into the world with purpose. Leaders who once doubted their ability suddenly realized that the authority behind their mission did not originate from themselves. The same pattern is unfolding now within your own awareness. The reassignment that was trying to reach you earlier has not disappeared. It has simply waited for you to become receptive enough to accept it. And acceptance begins with a simple but powerful action. In your mind, place your hand over your heart and feel the rhythm of your breath. That rhythm is the reminder that you are alive within the purpose that created you. Now allow these words to move through your spirit as a declaration rather than a request. Father, in the name that stands above every distraction and every voice of confusion, we acknowledge this moment of clarity. The signal that was once jammed is now restored. The noise that attempted to block understanding has been exposed and released. Let the mind of this chosen one become a sanctuary where your voice can be heard clearly again. Let every anxious frequency dissolve into peace. Let every accusation of inadequacy be replaced by the quiet confidence that comes from walking within your will. Over the coming days, allow the download that began earlier to complete its journey. Let strategy emerge where confusion once lived. Let ideas surface with precision and purpose. Let doors that once appeared locked reveal the keys that have been hidden within alignment. Bring the right people, the right opportunities, and the right confirmations into view so that the path ahead becomes unmistakable. This prayer is not about forcing something new into existence. It is about sealing what has already begun. The assignment has been written, the signal has been transmitted, and now the only question that remains is the one that heaven places gently before you. Are you willing to walk in the authority of this calling, even if the path feels unfamiliar at first? Are you willing to trust the clarity that arrives in stillness rather than the chaos that once dominated your attention? The answer to that question does not need to be spoken out loud for the world to hear. It only needs to echo within the chambers of your own spirit. If your answer is yes, then let that yes rise quietly but firmly within your mind. Let it become a declaration that you are ready to move forward with the assignment placed before you. Because the moment you accept that calling, something shifts in a profound way. You are no longer a person waiting anxiously for a signal from heaven. You become the one carrying that signal into the world around you. Your clarity becomes a light within confusion. Your calm becomes a refuge within chaos. Your presence begins transmitting the very frequency you once struggled to hear. The knocking you once sensed at the door of your awareness has now become the rhythm guiding your steps. And from this moment forward, you do not simply listen for the signal. You live as the signal itself.